Welcome to Ethics 240. Before we get started with the practical application of ethics, first I wanted to dive into some of the basic positions that we can take and some of the major theories that we're going to be dealing with throughout the semester. One of the major things that we'll talk about is moral absolutism or moral objectivity, as it's sometimes called, and there is a slight difference between the two, and we'll probably cover that later. But this position is that there are some things that are truly right and wrong. Just like 2 plus 2 equals 4, just like mathematical or logical truths, there are moral truths that are true regardless of what anyone thinks about it. So, like G.K. Chesterton's example of don't strangle babies, that's true regardless of what anyone thinks about it, and it's true at all times and all places. So this is what the moral absolutist or moral one who believes in moral objectivity believes, that morality is something that truly exists. Most religions, the Abrahamic faiths especially, are absolutist or believe in objective morality, that there are certain things that are true regardless of human opinion, that the moral law does not come from us, but that we are subject to this moral law. Now, in contrast to that, we have moral relativism. Moral relativism is kind of the opposite, that there is no objective truth, and that right and wrong are relative to either you, the individual, to your culture, to your nation. So something might be right for you or right for, say, Americans, but not right for the Japanese or the people of the South Solomon Islands or something like that. And one of the things that they're trying to get through with moral relativism is moral disputes. They can say, well, if we disagree with you, well, I can be right and you can be right at the same time. And so we can be tolerant and everything will be just wonderful and hunky-dory. But there's lots of problems with moral relativism, and we'll go further in depth into moral relativism later on. But the problems here are myriad. We've got the reformer's dilemma, for one. If relativism is up to the culture, well, then that means that whoever deviates from the culture is actually doing something morally wrong, right? Because if our morality is just derived from the culture, we should just be able to look at the mores of our culture and decide, okay, well, is this going against the broader culture that I'm a part of? Well, yes, it is, so therefore it's wrong. Well, that means that Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Jesus, Muhammad, any of these people who were moral reformers were actually the bad guys because they were going against the broader culture that they were a part of. So that seems right there to be intuitively false, that we would want to say that Gandhi or Jesus or Dr. Martin Luther King were the bad guys. We generally hold people like that in higher esteem. So there's problems right there with moral relativism. It's also fairly practically unlivable. How are we to understand what culture is? We have immigrant cultures. Think of someone who is a Muslim from, Malaysia or something like that, and comes to the United States. Should they conform to their Malaysian culture, to their Islamic culture, to American culture in their new land? Where's the cutoff there? Where are the lines of demarcation between these things? Not to mention subcultures and countercultures and things like that we're all a part of. It's ultimately self-defeating, in that its main goals are saying that, well, if everyone just recognized that morality is relative to everyone else or to cultures, then we would all be more tolerant towards each other. And so they preach tolerance, but that's the problem right there, is they're saying morality is something that is relative, and we want everyone to be tolerant. And so uh, tolerance is this transcendent value that transcends all other cultures and that all cultures should be participating in, right? So if you're saying it's relative, then uh, they shouldn't have any kind of overarching transcendent values like tolerance. So you can't really say that there's any kind of transcendent values there. So that's kind of self defeating. Not only that, but it also has a problem with moral progress. So we would probably want to say that we have made moral progress since the 1860s. We no longer have slavery, or the 1960s with civil rights, or since World War II with universal human rights. There's the sense that we are better than some of our ancestors in that sense that we've made better moral decisions. That we no longer hold slaves is better than slaveholding. However, with moral relativism, if we're just looking at a culture or a nation or even the individual, then we couldn't say that moral progress has been made because each one of those um, manifestations would be just as valid as the next. But that seems to be ultimately problematic, and I think anyone should be able to recognize that. Hopefully, we can. It cannot account for any obligation. To what are we obligated to? Why are we obligated to do anything? Why am I obligated not to strangle babies, or what have you? So there's lots of problems with moral relativism, and it ultimately preaches tolerance and acceptance of others and being generous towards others. Those are worthy goals, but not goals that relativism itself can actually account for. You could better account for that with moral objectivity in certain ways. So let's go on to our next theory. So we've got pluralism, and this seems rather problematic too, that there are moral truths, but they can and do conflict with each other. So they try and account for moral conflict. It tries to account for uh, some insights from all of our other theories, but it really doesn't work if there is conflict between these two things. Can something be both A and not A in the same time in the same way? Well, that seems problematic. Now, what we could say is that there's different manifestations of the same principles. Take the Indians and the Greeks in ancient times. Herodotus tells of a tribe of northern India that would eat their dead. They would make a broth basically with their dead body, and they would drink the broth, and that would bring in the spirits of their ancestors or whatever. And then you have the Greeks who would burn their dead on funeral pyres. Right, so we've got these two different things, and so Darius, the emperor of Persia, who has both these Greeks and these Galatians as their as his subjects, asks them about these different things and says, "Custom is king over all." But what Darius doesn't realize, and what these two different manifestations are, is respect for the dead, their funeral rites. So the goal here is some kind of respect for our ancestors. It is just manifested in two very, very different ways. So instead of saying that truths can and do conflict with each other, what we could say is that the manifestations may seem very different, but there is some kind of underlying objective value between the two. Or we could go with consequentialism. There's several versions of this. Utilitarianism is probably the most popular. So this is that the goodness is located in your consequences, in the consequences of whatever action. So clear-cut rules, it tells us what's right and what's wrong. Whatever has the best result is what's right. So you could go with egoism, that we always act in our own self-interest. This isn't selfishness. This is acting in a way that benefits yourself, which will oftentimes benefit other people too. Utilitarianism is that the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. And so you go through that, and there's a clear-cut process of, action A has the most happiness for the most amount of people, but action B has just happiness for me. Well, you go with action A for the utilitarianism. So a couple problems with that. Is happiness a worthy goal? Maybe, maybe not. If you're constantly searching for happiness, will you ever find it? Perhaps there's something with more value, justice or goodness or something else. And can we actually predict the results of our actions? Not really, not with any certainty. Um, we're never going to know exactly what the long-term results of our actions are going to be. Then we have deontology. These place goodness in the action itself, not in the result, but in the action. So you've got three different versions that we'll talk about in this class. We've got divine command theory. So this is that morality is revealed by some kind of revelation. So the Bible for Christians, the Tanakh for Jews, the Quran for Muslims, the cookbook of the Flying Spaghetti Monster for Pastafarians. So that is rather limited because whoever's not a follower of that religion, do they have the actual revelation? So that can be a problematic theory. Natural law, you've got Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, who was a famous churchman in the Middle Ages that promote this doctrine. It's fairly interesting in that we find out morality through our reason. So we understand morality just by reflecting on our actions. And so we can just, by our very nature, understand what is right and what is wrong. So that's a pretty popular theory for people who believe in objective morality. Thomas Aquinas has been enjoying quite a revival for the last 30 or 40 years. So a lot of people are paying more attention to his work, and of course Aristotle through Aquinas as well. Then you have Kantian ethics, this named after Immanuel Kant. He had the categorical imperative. And this basically states that if you can universalize an action, then it is the right thing to do. So the moral is the rational, and the rational is moral. So if there's something that you are considering doing, you ask yourself, can this be universalized? Can every single person, if every single person did this, would it be self-contradictory? If not, then it is the rational thing to do. So if you say, well, can I lie? I'm lying on this application for a loan for a car or something like that. And you say, well, if everyone lied on loan applications or just lied in general, then no one would believe anyone, because that is the point of lying, is to deceive people. But if everyone always lied, no one would be deceived because no one would believe anyone. So it makes a logical contradiction to try to lie all the time. Therefore, lying is not rational and therefore not moral. So it's a very interesting system, fairly popular, though it does have its problems. What obligates us to do these things. It can tell us what not to do fairly easily, but it can't give us really positive things to do. And of course, this is a very short introduction to these things. There's much more complicated. You could, read entire books on each one of these to figure out more about it. But this is just kind of an overview to get you started, and the book is going to give you much more information on these things. Here's one problem that you're probably going to see in this class, and perhaps others, and just encounter it out in the wild somewhere on YouTube or something, is the Euthyphro Dilemma. This is especially against divine command theory, but also against theism in general. And it is that this is from the Socratic dialogue by Plato called Euthyphro. Euthyphro takes his dad to court for certain reasons, and Socrates accosts him there in the market on his way to the court and asks him, oh, you must know justice. And of course, Euthyphro's like, yes, of course. And so Socrates keeps asking him about, where justice comes from. He says the gods. and all this, but it basically boils down to, is something good because God commands it, or does God command something because it's good? And the problem here is that it seems to make morality either arbitrary or God completely vacuous. So God could command the exact opposite of what he has already commanded, and because he commanded it, that means it's good. So if he wanted strangling babies to be the good thing, he could just command that and praise God, let's go strangle babies. Um, and then if God commands it on the other side, God commands something because it is already good, then that means that goodness is located outside of God, which is problematic for the Abrahamic faiths, say that everything must come from God. So if goodness is outside of God, then is God answering to something else? Are we answering to something else? So it makes, for classical theism, quite the problem. However, there is a rebuttal to this called essentialism. Essentialism is that God's commands don't just, and that goodness don't come strictly from his commands, they come from his essence. God is essentially good. He is goodness itself. So God could no more make a square circle or a married bachelor than he could make a torturing babies for the fun of it or strangling babies morally praiseworthy. That would not be an exercise of his power. That would be a deficiency in his moral perfection. So it is not that God is limited, it is that God's perfection is without limitation. And so he can avoid such limitations as giving some kind of command that would be morally wrong, because his very nature is goodness itself. So that's one answer that theists will give for the Euthyphro Dilemma, and they'll say it is a false dilemma, that there is that third option. And so this is actually committing the fallacy of bifurcation. So that is a short overview of some of the theories and some of the problems of the theories. The book gives much more detail on them. And we'll probably have a few more short videos explaining them in more detail as we go on through the course.